Today, we wanted to discuss a very particular type of mobile work or mobile labor. That is mobile labor in the humanitarian sector, very broadly conceived, of course. And I think the most famous example would be Doctors Without Frontiers, and also the emerging phenomenon like many volunteers and NGO workers going to the Mediterranean Sea for the rescue actions towards asylum seekers coming from Africa is also a manifestation of this type of mobile labor. And then we also have kind of bureaucrats or quasi-bureaucrats who are dealing with things such as asylum applications. They are also becoming very mobile. So why are they so mobile, and what does this tell us? Is this because the world is becoming nicer? There's more and more humanitarian concerns, which is good? Or does it tell us that actually the local resilience is declining, so therefore local societies, local places always need aid from outside? Or yet again, probably it means the whole world order is changing. You need lots of fly in, fly out humanitarian workers to maintain basic social infrastructure. Today, I'm very pleased we have our friend and also our first in-person visiting fellow, Julia Morris, joining us. Julia, could you please introduce yourself briefly first?
Yeah, so I'm an assistant professor in international studies at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, where I've been for the last 2 years now. And very excited, very grateful to be able to come here for the summer to finish off my book project at the Max Planck Institute in Halle.
Welcome, Julia. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I understand your book is partly dealing with this mobile NGO workers, humanitarian workers, and also government officials or quasi-officials, like consultants, right, going to Nauru. And why are they mobile, and who are these people, and what is the basic pattern of mobility? If we treat them as a special type of mobile workers, can you give us a kind of overview picture first?
Yeah, so my book, From Phosphate to Refugees, the offshore refugee industry in the Republic of Nauru, so it really looks quite specifically at the mobile workforce that circulates around various aspects of asylum, so refugee status determination, refugee processing, and then resettlement, in a very controversial context where the government of Australia has essentially financed a number of small Pacific islands, the Republic of Nauru being the most prominent and the most infamous, to essentially carry out various aspects of refugee status determination and resettlement. And Nauru and Australia have worked together to send asylum seekers, people who are migrants who are making their way by boat across the Indian Ocean, normally going from Sri Lanka or Indonesia, or they're originally coming from a range of countries, particularly in the Middle East, Iran, Iraq. And they are then sent, or they were sent, this has been a sort of an on and off again policy, to Manus Island in Papua New Guinea or Nauru. And they're then processed, their asylum claims are processed, and if they are successfully determined to be a refugee by fly in, fly out, predominantly Australian personnel, they were then given refugee visas for initially it was 5 years, it was then extended on an ever-rolling basis to 20 years and resettled in the islands. And because Nauru didn't have an asylum system or any kind of resettlement procedures before, the Australian government contracted a number of service providers, predominantly in Australia, and Australia has a very long history of having quite an institutionalized asylum determination and resettlement system. So you have these mobile workforces who, many of whom have also worked in other regions or who I had met when I was doing my research at refugee studies conferences or different sorts of institutional fora. and constitute this kind of fly-in, fly-out, and with many parallels to the offshore mining industry, I soon found.
Yeah.
And that was what I was looking at a lot of these continuities with Nauru's first major resource extraction project around phosphate. And will then fly to these, I conceptualize them as extractive zones or resource boom regions around humans, and will then carry out various aspects of processing and resettlement of people.
That's fascinating. And can you tell us a bit more about the service providers? Who are they exactly? The private firms or the kind of quasi non-for-profit NGOs?
Many of them are either non-governmental organizations, so humanitarian organizations, particularly when it comes to resettlement or management. The Australian Immigration Department actually were the ones who were doing the actual processing of people's asylum claims. So people were on these sort of fly-in, fly-out stints, residing in Nauru for periods of time and then going back to Australia and then coming back to Nauru and processing claims. They were also training Nauruans in carrying out this kind of processing, although there were a lot of issues with Nauruans being able to take that on. To do with not having access to the same kinds of security clearance that the Australian government had. And so, and then you also have private corporations as well, many of whom are involved in security or in construction work.
And for the camps.
For the camps and creating these sort of modular dwellings that people are residing in. So you have a spectrum of different organizations, some of whom are more explicitly humanitarian, although it's a very controversial arrangement, so there's a lot of discrepancies around that. Or you have humanitarian workers who also get hired on by private corporations because they're trained in these various aspects of, it could be social workers. So they might then take on positions within private corporations too and sort of hop in and out of different working sectors.
I see. So it's, the three sectors are really entangled, right? The government and the private corporations and the humanitarian NGOs and the social worker individuals included. In your case, are their mobilities coordinated? And it seems to be, of course, everything started with this government action, right? They contract out the processing procedure. And so everything is built around that. But there particular, is there any kind of meta agencies that coordinate mobilities of all these personnel, or actually it is assemblage that everyone manages their own, but somehow come together because of the contract system?
Yeah, I guess the way I portray it, it sounds like it's a smooth process, but it's definitely very messy. I mean, the Australian government is, I guess, the meta agency, as much as there can be a meta agency of contracting various organizations into the different procedures that are required for these essentially industry operations. So they are somewhat coordinating which organizations come together, as is the Nauruan government, because in Nauru a number of organizations also sprung up with this essentially resource boom industry that developed in the island. So a number of entrepreneurial Nauruans created security agencies, for example. So there are close to 10 security agencies locally that were created by different locals and were contracted into various aspects. So it kind of took on a life of its own in terms of the industrial assemblage that came together. And then you also have knowledge-making industries. So things like educational curricula in Nauru, which were reshaped to really for students, for young children,
for local students,
for school children to understand about the various aspects of processing asylum seekers and resettling refugees. So in a way, it's the sort of this spectrum that's quite difficult to pin to one meta agency.
I see. Well, that's interesting. It really shows that kind of industrial dynamics, right? It's one thing lead to another, and all different type of populations see different niches of making profit or to be part of this bigger system. What kind of experiences do this mobile workforce have, as you observed? I mean, do they feel very privileged, or they experience high level of anxieties, or lots of internal struggling about the meaning of the work? Is it possible to give some kind of vignette about their experiential and mental processes that they go through, fly in and fly out?
Yeah, so a number of workers came, particularly workers who were involved with humanitarian agencies, or workers who then went to private firms because they were concerned about a private firm being involved, came from having done work in refugee camps in different locations around the world, or having done a lot of similar institutionalized work in humanitarian settings in Australia. And a lot of those individuals had a lot of ethical grapplings with the morality of their work. So were constantly questioning whether it was a good idea for them to be there, because none of the migrants who were being processed there actually wanted to be in Nauru. So you had these huge tensions and conflicts that arose. And so people were quite morally grappling with the situation. And then you had others who came from explicit conflict zones, many of whom were more involved with the private security firms or corporations. And some of those individuals had been working in explicit conflict contexts, like in Afghanistan or in Iraq. And some of those individuals who I spoke with said that they actually found the work very easy to deal with because it wasn't the same kind of violence that they had experienced in those conflict zones. So they were able to almost kind of shut off from the realities of working in Nauru. And those were sort of the main positions that people were coming from, but there was a lot of moral conflict.
Of course, yeah, that's very interesting. This shows that their mobilities of this workforce is not only between Australia and Nauru, right? Actually, their trajectory is much longer, as you mentioned. Many people moved from other parts of the world into this practice, including worked in conflict zones